this episode, we're going to move from simply knowing about threats to doing something useful with that knowledge in a real environment. New learners often picture threat intelligence as a news feed that tells you what bad actors are doing, but the real value shows up only when intelligence changes your decisions, your detections, and your response speed. The challenge is that intelligence often arrives as scattered fragments, like a suspicious domain here, a file hash there, and a short write-up somewhere else, and none of it helps if it never becomes a concrete action. When defenders talk about turning intelligence into action, they mean building a repeatable pathway that takes raw information and turns it into searching, alerting, blocking, and learning. You'll see how TIPS, IoC sharing, structured threat information expression, STIX, trusted automated exchange of intelligence information, TAXII, Sigma, yet another recursive acronym, YARA, and Snort fit into that pathway, and why each one matters for a beginner who is learning to think like a defender. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Before we touch any of those terms, it helps to clarify what counts as threat intelligence in a practical sense. Threat intelligence is information that helps you reduce risk by improving prevention, detection, or response, and it is most useful when it is specific enough to act on. Some intelligence is strategic, like understanding which industries are being targeted and why, and some is tactical, like indicators and patterns that can be searched for today. Beginners often assume tactical intelligence is always best because it feels actionable, but strategic intelligence can still shape action by changing priorities and investments. Another key point is that intelligence is not automatically true because it can be outdated, mistaken, or relevant to a different environment than yours. Turning intelligence into action, therefore, begins with a small discipline. Validate relevance, assess confidence, and decide what action makes sense given the cost of being wrong. When you learn to do that consistently, intelligence stops being trivia and starts becoming a decision input. A big part of action is process, and that's where tips come in as an organizing idea rather than a magical solution. A tip is a platform or approach for collecting, organizing, enriching, and distributing threat intelligence so it can be used by security teams and tools. Beginners should think of tips as the place where raw intelligence gets translated into something structured, tracked, and reusable, rather than living in random emails and chat messages. The value is that you can attach context, like when an indicator was seen, why it matters, how confident you are, and what response is recommended. The limitation is that a tip does not create intelligence out of thin air, and it will not automatically make your organization smart if the inputs are messy and the workflow is unclear. Turning intelligence into action means using tips to create a consistent life cycle where items arrive, are triaged, are turned into detections or blocks when appropriate, and are retired when they are no longer useful. Without that life cycle, you end up with a pile of stale indicators that create noise instead of protection. IoC sharing is one of the most common ways intelligence travels between organizations, and it sounds simple until you consider what makes an IoC useful. An IoC is a piece of evidence that suggests malicious activity, such as a domain, an address, a file hash, a process pattern, or another observable artifact. Beginners often assume an IoC is a proof of compromise, but it is better understood as a lead that must be evaluated in context. Some IOCs are high confidence and narrow, like a file hash tied to a specific malicious sample, while others are broad and risky, like an address range that could later be reassigned to innocent services. Turning IoC sharing into action means deciding how you will use different kinds of IOCs, whether you will search for them, alert on them, or block them, and under what conditions. It also means recording where the IOC came from and how fresh it is, because age matters a lot for many indicators. When you treat IOCs as leads with lifespans, you make better choices and reduce the chance that you block something legitimate for no good reason. A key beginner skill is learning the difference between actions that are safe by default and actions that are risky by default. Searching your logs for a shared IOC is usually safe because it helps you investigate without impacting operations. Alerting on an IoC can be safe if you tune it and add context, but it can also create noise if the indicator is too broad or too common. Blocking an IoC is the riskiest action because it can cause outages or break business processes if the indicator overlaps with legitimate services. Turning intelligence into action is therefore not a single step, but a ladder of response options, where you start with investigation and then move toward blocking only when confidence and impact justify it. Beginners often want a simple rule like always block known bad domains, but reality is messy because what is known bad in one report might be mixed use in practice. A disciplined workflow uses tiers, where low-confidence items drive searches, medium-confidence items drive monitoring, and high-confidence items drive preventive controls. That approach keeps intelligence useful without turning it into disruption. The reason defenders care so much about formats is that format is what makes automation possible, and that's where STIX and TAXII fit in. STIX is a standardized way to represent threat information, like indicators, threat actor descriptions, relationships between objects, and context that helps you understand why something matters. TAXII is a standardized way to share that information between systems, so the intelligence can move reliably without someone copying and pasting it manually. Beginners should not worry about memorizing object names or fields, but they should understand the core value. Structured intelligence can be processed by tools, filtered by relevance, enriched automatically, and distributed to the right places. When intelligence is unstructured, it tends to stay stuck in human conversations, which slows everything down. Structured sharing also supports consistency, because two teams can interpret the same intelligence in the same way when the same fields and relationships are preserved. Turning intelligence into action at scale usually requires structure, because you cannot manually triage and reformat everything forever. STIX and TAXII are part of how organizations avoid drowning as the volume of intelligence grows. That said, structure does not solve the more subtle problem, which is deciding what to trust and how long to trust it. Even a perfectly structured indicator can be wrong, and even a correctly observed indicator can become irrelevant as attackers change infrastructure. Turning intelligence into action means building exploration and review into your process, so indicators do not live forever. It also means enrichment, which is adding context such as whether an indicator has been seen in your environment, whether it is associated with known malicious behavior, and whether it overlaps with legitimate services. Beginners sometimes think enrichment is a luxury, but it is a practical necessity because it helps you decide what to do without guessing. Another important concept is provenance, meaning you track where the intelligence came from and how it was produced, because that affects confidence. If you don't know the source or the method, you should be more cautious about automatic blocking. A mature process treats intelligence as living information that must be maintained, not as permanent truth. Now we can connect intelligence to detection content, which is where Sigma becomes useful as a bridge between ideas and queries. Sigma is a rule format that describes detection logic in a way that can be translated into searches across different log systems. Beginners can think of Sigma as a common language for describing what to look for in logs, such as patterns of process execution, suspicious command lines, unusual authentication sequences, or other behaviors. The advantage is that when the same detection idea is written in a portable format, different teams can apply it even if they use different log platforms. The deeper lesson is that behavior-focused detections often age better than simple IOCs, because attackers can change a domain name quickly, but they often can't avoid certain behaviors required to reach a goal. Turning intelligence into action means using intelligence reports to identify behaviors and then expressing those behaviors as repeatable detection logic. Sigma helps with that because it encourages structured thinking about fields, conditions, and matching criteria rather than vague descriptions. When you begin to see detection as reusable content, you start building a library of defensive knowledge that improves over time. The next piece is YARA, which is a way to express patterns that can help identify suspicious or malicious files and content. Beginners often hear YARA described as a way to write rules for malware, and that's broadly true, but the important idea is matching on meaningful characteristics rather than relying only on file names or single hashes. A YARA rule can look for specific strings, byte patterns, or combinations of features that suggest a file belongs to a certain family or has a certain capability. The value is that this can catch variants, meaning slightly modified versions of a threat, where a simple hash match would fail. The limitation is that YARA rules require care, because rules that are too broad will match benign files, and rules that are too narrow will miss variants. Turning intelligence into action here means translating what you learned about a threat into a detection pattern that can be used consistently, and then testing that pattern so it produces trustworthy results. Another beginner misunderstanding is assuming YARA is only for incident response labs, when it can also support proactive scanning of repositories or endpoints depending on the environment. The core point is that YARA turns intelligence about file characteristics into a repeatable detection method. Snort is another place where intelligence becomes action, but the focus shifts from files to network traffic and network behavior. Snort is commonly associated with network intrusion detection and prevention, where rules describe patterns in traffic that indicate suspicious activity. Beginners do not need to learn rule syntax to understand what matters. A network rule is an attempt to recognize an attack or a malicious communication by what it looks like on the wire. The power is that network visibility can reveal scanning, exploitation attempts, command and control patterns, and unusual protocol use, often before an endpoint detection system notices anything. The limitation is that encryption reduces what can be inspected, and modern traffic is often encrypted, which means network rules may need to rely more on metadata and less on payload content. Turning intelligence into action with network rules involves choosing what is appropriate to detect at the network layer, placing sensors where they can actually see the relevant traffic, and tuning rules so they don't flood you with noise. It also involves being honest about coverage, because a network rule that is never applied to the traffic you care about is not protection, it is paperwork. The best outcome is when network detections complement endpoint and identity detections rather than trying to replace them. One of the most important beginner lessons across Sigma, YARA, and Snort is that good detections usually focus on behaviors and relationships, not just on single artifacts. Intelligence often arrives as a domain name or a hash, but the report usually contains more valuable information about what the attacker is trying to do and how they tend to do it. Turning intelligence into action means extracting those behavioral clues and converting them into detection logic that fits your environment's telemetry. That might mean looking for unusual parent-child process relationships, unusual authentication patterns, unusual outbound connections, or suspicious access to sensitive resources. It also means tying detections to context, such as critical assets and privileged accounts, so you can prioritize the results. Beginners sometimes think detection content is either correct or incorrect, but it is often probabilistic, meaning it increases suspicion rather than proving compromise. That is why detections should be designed to be investigated, with enough context to support quick triage. When you treat detections as starting points for investigation, you build a healthier and more sustainable monitoring program. Another essential part of turning intelligence into action is lifecycle management, because detections and indicators must be maintained or they become liabilities. IoCs go stale, infrastructure gets reused, and detection rules that were once accurate can become noisy as systems change. A mature workflow includes reviewing what detections are producing, measuring false positives, and adjusting logic to keep alerts actionable. It also includes retiring content that no longer provides value, because clutter in detection libraries becomes a form of blindness. Beginners sometimes assume more detections always means more security, but an overloaded system is less effective than a smaller set of high-quality rules. Tips can help here by tracking when an indicator was last seen, when a rule was last updated, and what outcomes it produced, which supports disciplined maintenance. Another important lifecycle concept is feedback, where analysts who investigate alerts provide notes about what was useful and what was missing, and that feedback improves future detections. Turning intelligence into action is therefore not a one-time conversion. It is a continuous improvement loop. The more consistent the loop, the more your defensive capability grows over time. It also helps to understand the difference between sharing intelligence and sharing decisions, because sharing an IoC is not the same as sharing what to do with it. Two organizations can see the same indicator and make different choices based on different risk tolerances, different critical assets, and different exposure patterns. Turning intelligence into action requires local decision-making, because only you know what will break if you block something, and only you know what systems are most important. That is why structured formats like STIX are so valuable, because they can carry context and relationships that support better decisions. It is also why playbooks matter, because when a new indicator arrives, you don't want to improvise the response every time. Beginners sometimes think playbooks are rigid, but good playbooks are flexible frameworks that guide decisions while allowing exceptions when evidence demands it. The goal is to make your response consistent and timely, not robotic. When intelligence arrives fast, a prepared organization can act fast without acting recklessly. A final way to bring all of this together is to picture an intelligence-to-action pipeline as a series of translations. First, you translate external information into relevance for your environment, which depends on your assets and exposures. Next, you translate relevant intelligence into actions, starting with searching and monitoring and escalating to blocking only when confidence supports it. Then you translate those actions into repeatable content, like Sigma detections, YARA rules, and network signatures, so the same lesson can protect you again tomorrow. Finally, you translate outcomes back into learning, so you refine content, adjust priorities, and improve processes. Tips: STIX and TAXII help with the organization and distribution of intelligence, while Sigma, YARA, and Snort help with expressing intelligence as detection and prevention logic. The entire pipeline succeeds only when humans apply disciplined judgment, because automation without judgment can create outages and noise. Beginners should find this reassuring, because it means your thinking and your process matter as much as any tool. The defender's advantage comes from structured curiosity and repeatable execution. To conclude, turning intelligence into action is the skill of converting information into measurable security outcomes without creating chaos. Tips help organize and govern the intelligence lifecycle. IoC sharing provides leads that can drive searches and targeted monitoring. STIX and TAXII provide structure and transport so intelligence can move reliably at scale, and Sigma, YARA, and Snort represent different ways to express intelligence as detection content across logs, files, and network traffic. The key is to treat intelligence as time-sensitive and context-dependent, because what is useful today may be useless or harmful tomorrow if it becomes stale or overly broad. Action also requires restraint, because blocking is powerful but risky, while searching and correlation are safer early steps that build confidence. When you build a disciplined pipeline that validates relevance, enriches context, and converts behaviors into repeatable detections, intelligence stops being a pile of facts and becomes a practical defensive capability. That capability is what helps you detect earlier, respond faster, and learn continuously, which is exactly what defenders need in environments that change faster than any single rule set can keep up with.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.